Chapter 7, Wings of Light. The battlefield stretched endlessly under the darkened sky, a patchwork of consecrated ground glowing faintly and blood-soaked earth where the horde had pushed through. Screams of pain and defiance echoed in the air, underscored by the guttural growls of the undead. The Crusaders fought valiantly, but their movements grew slower, their strikes weaker. Amidst the chaos, the female paladin fought with a fiery resolve. Her crimson-trimmed armor bore the scars of countless blows, yet she moved with the precision of one who knew no fear. Her blade, slick with the ichor of the undead, sang as it cleaved through the unholy. But even she could feel it, the weight of despair creeping into her heart. For every enemy she struck down, two more seemed to take its place. Her breathing quickened, her grip on her sword tightening as the unrelenting tide pressed closer. And then she saw him. Commander Aldric stood at the heart of the chaos, his silver-plated armor shining like a beacon amidst the dark. His sword, ablaze with holy energy, carved through the undead with an intensity that defied exhaustion. His voice, steady and commanding, rang out across the battlefield. "Soldiers of Highwall, rally to me, the light will not falter." His words cut through the noise, igniting a spark in every soldier who heard them. The Crusaders raised their weapons, their cries echoing his as they surged forward with renewed strength. The paladin's breath hitched. She had always admired Aldric for his strength, his unyielding faith. Now, as she watched him lead with such fervor, she felt something stir within her. A flame, small at first, but growing with each passing moment. Her strikes became faster, harder. Her blade cut through the undead as though guided by the light itself. And then it happened. A warmth bloomed in her chest, spreading outward until it engulfed her entire being. She gasped, stumbling back as golden flames erupted around her. The heat didn't burn. Instead, it filled her with a power so overwhelming, it brought tears to her eyes. "By the light," she whispered. Wings of radiant energy unfurled from her back, each feather shimmering with divine light. The battlefield seemed to pause as every eye turned toward her. She took a step forward, her movements weightless, her blade blazing with holy fire. The undead recoiled, their shrieks of defiance turning to cries of fear. Each swing of her sword sent waves of divine energy rippling through their ranks, scattering them like leaves in a storm. "For Highwall," she roared, her voice ringing out like a celestial trumpet. Aldric felt the shift immediately. The light from her transformation was unmistakable, blazing brighter than any torch on the battlefield. He turned for a fleeting moment, his breath catching in his chest as he saw her. The female paladin, wings of holy energy unfurled, her every movement a symphony of divine power. A flicker of pride and hope surged through him, a fragile but brilliant ember against the overwhelming darkness. Yet the battlefield offered no respite. He turned back, raising his shield just in time to block a blow aimed at one of his soldiers. "Hold the line," he bellowed, his voice cutting through the cacophony of war. The Crusaders around him rallied, their shields locking together as they pushed forward. Aldric's blade flashed, cleaving through an undead soldier in a single, precise motion. His movements were deliberate, his strikes fueled by purpose rather than desperation. Yet even as he fought, he felt the weight of the unending tide pressing against their line. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure in tattered robes emerged from the ranks of the horde, its skeletal fingers clutching a staff that pulsed with a sickly green light. The air around it seemed to warp, the magic emanating from its presence distorting the very fabric of the battlefield. An undead mage. Aldric's heart sank. He had faced such creatures before, and he knew the devastation they could wreak. He tightened his grip on his sword, the hilt slick with sweat and ichor. As the mage raised its staff, a bolt of fire erupted from its tip, hurtling toward him. Aldric raised his shield, the impact sending a jarring tremor through his arm. The first bolt was followed by a second, then a third, each strike testing the limits of his strength. The golden glow of the High Priestess's blessing pulsed faintly on his shield, absorbing some of the impact, but he knew it would not last. The fourth bolt struck true, its force sending him to his knees. Aldric gasped, the wind knocked from his lungs as pain lanced through his body. His sword fell from his grasp, clattering against the ground as the world around him blurred. The air seemed to thicken, each breath a battle in itself. No, he growled, his voice a guttural rasp. He forced his head to lift, his vision swimming as he locked eyes with the mage. The creature stepped closer, its hollow gaze fixed on him with cruel satisfaction. Its staff crackled with energy, the air around it shimmering as it prepared another attack. Aldric gritted his teeth, willing himself to stand, but his limbs refused to obey. Then, a shadow moved behind him. The blade came swiftly, jagged and cruel. It pierced his back with a sickening sound, emerging through his chest in a spray of divine light. Aldric's breath hitched, the pain searing and immediate. His gaze fell to the blade, his fingers twitching as he reached for it instinctively. But his strength was gone. He felt the cold embrace of the earth as he fell forward, his head striking the ground. His vision dimmed, the sounds of the battlefield fading into a distant hum. Aldric's sword lay just beyond his grasp, its holy light flickering weakly as if mourning its master. "Captain!" a voice screamed, cutting through the cacophony of battle like a blade. The female paladin turned sharply, her radiant wings faltering as she followed the cry. Her heart sank as her eyes locked onto the motionless form of Commander Aldric, his silver-plated armor stained with crimson streaks. The faint golden glow of the High Priestess's blessing flickered around him for a brief, mournful moment, before fading entirely, leaving him bathed in shadow. Her chest tightened, a visceral ache spreading through her body as the weight of his loss threatened to pull her to her knees. This wasn't just another casualty, it was Aldric, their leader, their beacon of hope. Without him, the battle felt lost. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling, her breath catching as the horde surged forward, emboldened by their triumph. Their guttural cries of victory echoed across the battlefield, their relentless advance pressing harder against the Crusaders' the blunt, dwindling line. But then something shifted. The ache in her chest transformed, morphing into a burning fire that coursed through her veins. Her wings, dim and faltering, flared brighter than ever, their radiant light piercing the gloom. "No!" she roared, her voice echoing with divine fury. The ground beneath her feet pulsed with holy energy as she surged forward, her blade igniting with flames of celestial power. Each swing sent waves of light rippling through the horde, disintegrating the undead on contact. The force of her strikes carved a path straight through their ranks, scattering them like leaves in a storm. "For Aldric!" she cried, her voice carrying a raw, unyielding strength. "For Highwall!" Her rallying cry rang out like a trumpet call, cutting through the despair that had gripped the Crusaders. Those nearest to her faltered for only a moment before their faces hardened with renewed resolve. The soldiers raised their weapons, their voices joining hers in a chorus of defiance. "For Aldric! For Highwall!" The paladin's blade burned brighter with each strike, its holy light illuminating the battlefield like a second dawn. Her every movement was fueled by a ferocious combination of grief and fury, her swings growing faster and harder as she tore through the horde. The Crusaders surged forward behind her, their despair giving way to righteous anger. Their weapons glowed faintly with the remnants of the High Priestess's blessing, each strike landing with the strength of their renewed faith. The horde, emboldened just moments before, now faltered under the relentless assault. Their cohesion broke as the Crusaders drove them back, step by agonizing step. The female paladin's wings unfurled fully, their brilliance casting long shadows over the battlefield. Her strikes cleaved through multiple undead at once, the divine energy radiating from her blade forcing the horde to retreat in disarray. Yet even as she fought, her heart ached. She glanced back toward Aldric's lifeless form, his bloodied sword lying just beyond his reach. The image seared into her mind, driving her forward with an almost manic determination. As the undead horde reeled, the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. It was faint at first, a soft glow that barely touched the battlefield, but as the sun crept higher, its golden rays illuminated the chaos, turning the blood-streaked ground into a field of stark contrasts. The paladin stood at the forefront, her armor shimmering in the dawn's light. Her wings, now tinged with the sun's golden hue, seemed larger, more commanding. She raised her blade high, its flames still dancing as she turned to her comrades. "We will not falter," she cried, her voice hoarse but resolute. "For the light, for Highwall!" The Crusaders answered with a resounding cheer, their voices carrying across the battlefield. One by one, they pressed forward, their strikes filled with the strength of their convictions. For a moment, the paladin allowed herself to hope. But then, from the corner of her eye, she saw movement. Unnatural, jarring. She turned, her breath catching in her throat. It was him. Aldric's lifeless body, now animated by a foul and unnatural force, pushed itself to its feet. One skeletal hand reached down to retrieve his severed head, holding it aloft as his empty gaze locked onto her. In the other hand he gripped his sword, the divine glow now twisted into something dark and corrupted. He began to walk toward her, each step deliberate, each movement a cruel mockery of the man he once was. The paladin's wings faltered, their light dimming as her breath quickened. Her blade trembled in her hand. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising din of the horde. She staring into the hollow, lifeless eyes of the man who had once been her commander, the battlefield around her bathed in the soft light of a dawn that felt like anything but hope.